Well, I think that at the essence of neoliberalism is the notion that that the essence of democracy is basically about making money. That the market is a template for all social relations. That anything that doesn't fit into market values, it really basically doesn't count. That there's a massive transfer of public wealth to private hands. There's an ongoing attempt to privatize almost everything. There's an attempt to deregulate business. There's an attempt to basically hold back all those institutions and organizations that speak to the public good, whether we're talking about education, or we're talking about unions, or we're talking about social provisions. So, I mean, I think overall what you're seeing in neoliberalism is an attempt to basically completely undo the parameters of the public, to do away with all notions of the public, whether it's an ideology, whether it's a mode of transportation, or whether it's basically a mode of solidarity, and to utterly privatize those things so as to assume and to claim that the only thing that really motivates people is really making money, that profit is the essence of all human relationships. We've lost the language of compassion, and we've lost the public spheres that nourish it, and we've lost a media that has any interest in it. In a world in which sovereignty is now corporate rather than political, and corporations define values, and corporations define social relationships, and corporations define what matters in life. What matters is money. So you get sick, I mean, I'm going to reward the person who works for me in my insurance company for making sure you don't get the treatment you need, because that's going to save me money. Somehow economics now drives politics, and economics has completely divorced itself from any sense of ethical considerations and social cost. Young people are basically in a position unlike they ever have been before. I mean, given what is the social disinvestment in young people that's gone on since the 1980s, is really quite remarkable. I mean, in my vocabulary, I call it a war on youth. And the war on youth takes two forms. There's a hard war and a soft war. The soft war is the war of endless commercialization and commodification. Kids are treated as commodities. They're told that the only thing that really matters is buying and selling. They're bombarded every day by an ideology in multiple forms, on multiple platforms, that tell them that self-interest is the ultimate interest, and that what really matters is buying and disposing goods, and advertising goods, and branding themselves. The hard war is a war in which increasingly what we find are kids being punished in ways unlike we've ever seen before. We have the school-to-prison pipeline where you've got endless numbers, and when I say kids, young people, I'm talking about low-income, poor minority students. These students have become disposable. And as a disposable population, there's almost no investment in them except basically to get them out of the way, put them in schools that basically contain them, and once they get out of those schools, then they find themselves basically in what we might call the mass incarceration state. I mean, we live in a country in which more people are imprisoned than any other country in the world. And not only that, we live in a country in which there are more people in prison at this time, 70% of which are people of color, than there were in Stalin's gulags at its height. So I think that what you see here is, as the social state is diminished, as the welfare state and all of the funding that goes into it for not just social provisions like Medicare, but also schools and so forth and so on, you see taking place the rise of the punishing state. The punishing state compensates for all these gaps. Because think about this: all of a sudden you have kids who are unemployed. You have what we call a zero. This is the zero generation. Zero hope, zero employment, zero futures. And it seems to me that these kids, there's no spaces for them. And the only spaces that we find for them, the default space, has now basically become the prison. So you have something called punishment creep, where the model of the prison now begins to seep into other institutions. And you see it particularly in schools around zero tolerance policies, where kids are being, cops, there are more policemen in schools than there are teachers. And what you see is kids being handcuffed, put in the back of police cars for violating dress codes or for doodling on their on their desk. We're not talking about 17-year-olds. We're talking about 10-year-olds. What kind of language nourishes the notion of civic life? What kind of formative culture has to be in place? What kind of public spheres have to be available? I mean, what kind of institutions have to provide support for people to be critical, to engage in dialogue, to participate and believe that what really matters is not only a sense of self, but a sense of social responsibility? And increasingly what we've seen for the last 35 years is an ideology that had basically completely undermined that sense of social responsibility. I mean, think about it. I mean, we have right-wing Republicans in the United States Congress and in Senate saying things like, kids who get free lunches in schools should be forced to work. We have people saying that, grasping onto this logic of rabid individualism and individual responsibility and this absolutely eviscerated notion of freedom, right? It's freedom from, not freedom to, right? Freedom is a negative force, right? That people are ultimately responsible for their own fate, as if larger structural forces don't exist, as if the problems that people face, for instance, massive pollution, is caused by me, and not by the major corporations. And so there's what we've seen disappear in this discourse, which is to me the essence of the problem, is an inability to translate private troubles into larger structural public considerations. We have no way of understanding that link anymore, because what we've done is we've defined freedom in a way that suggests it's the freedom to do anything you want and screw everybody else. We've defined self-interest as the ultimate measure of what it means to take responsibility for yourself. We've made the claim that social responsibility is a pathology. But what you really need is, you need a new birth. Right? I mean, we need somebody else. I mean, we need a party that really says, hey, look, we don't believe society should be defined by corporations. We don't believe in this massive inequality in wealth and income. We believe in justice. Justice is something that shouldn't be bought. Everybody should have the basic social provisions that expands the possibility for their own agency. Everybody. That's a social issue. That's not just an issue of individual responsibility. So I think we have to draw a new map. We have to in some way embrace a new set of policies. We saw hints of that with the Occupy movement. We saw hints of it with the Quebec student movement, this year. We see hints of it in the No Idle movement among indigenous populations in Canada. And I think that that's a long march through the revolution, through the institutions. It takes time. Education is at the center of politics. It's at the center. It's not just something that happens in schools. It happens all over the place. It happens in the cultural apparatuses. It happens here in terms of this interview. It happens in terms of how corporations try to define what counts and what doesn't. And education has to be reclaimed, and it has to have a very different mission and a very different purpose and a very different set of practices. It's not about methods. It's basically about educating people in ways to enhance their sense of critique, to expand the critical imagination, to lead them to believe that they can think. In order to think otherwise, in order to act otherwise, they have to think otherwise. And it also suggests that they have to do it collectively, that they can't do it individually. So you need a formative culture at work that once again reclaims all those things that matter in a civic culture: compassion, justice, equality, the ability to relate to others in a way that expands and deepens the very process of democracy itself. And secondly, you need social movements that are broad-based. Broad-based. We can't, identity politics is fine, and it addresses specific issues, but we need broad-based social movements that address the totality of society. I think you gotta live standing up rather than on your knees, I think you have to believe in something other than yourself. I think that you have to believe that the world can be a better place, and you need to fight for it. I think you have to believe that you can't do it alone. You have to do it collectively. And I think you have to believe that justice is going dead in us all the time, and we have to find ways to revive that. And we have to do it in ways that's compassionate, engages the notion of social responsibility, takes seriously what it means to be intellectually alive, and always to spark the imagination and to always take risk.